Hey everyone, George here, and today I want to talk about the book 1776 by David Mccullough. As you can tell from the title of the book, 1776, it covers the first year of the American Revolutionary War. It doesn't cover all 8 years and some odd months of the war, but even though it only covers the first year, don't let that discourage you. This book is fantastic. It will show you from the beginning of 1776 and take you all the way to the end of 1776. And during that time, you will have an intimate understanding of the start of the American Revolution. You'll have an intimate understanding of what went on in England with King George III and some of the key players in the British military. You'll have a very intimate understanding of George Washington during that very difficult year in 1776, and also just a whole other group of key players in that year of 1776. You will learn so much about them, and you will understand those 12 months so well that you will feel like you're an expert. That's how good this book was written. So like I said, this book covers the year 1776, but actually the book opens up in late 1775. Bunker Hill has already taken place. The Battle of Bunker Hill has already happened. And King George III in England needs to make a decision of what to do next. This book goes into what went on in England after Bunker Hill. So it will explain all the back and forth and debates, and that there were actually proponents in England that were against sending money and troops over to America. So this book will go into the decision-making and the thinking that went on for King George III to make the decision to send the might of the British Empire to America and squash the rebellion right there in Boston. This book will explain everything about Knox's expedition, so Knox was a bookseller in Boston, and he was trusted by George Washington to go up to Fort Ticonderoga to get all this artillery, all these cannons. They desperately needed artillery and firepower to fight the British. So he went up there, up to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, to gather all that stuff. And you will learn about just how difficult of a journey that was and how difficult of a feat that was. But he managed to bring all those cannons intact down to the Boston area, and George Washington was so impressed that he instantly gave Knox a promotion, and he was in charge of the artillery. It's March 1776. George Washington has all the artillery he needs, and he hatches a brilliant plan and drives the British out of Boston. It was a big success, and it was a serious high point for the Americans that year. Unfortunately for them, it will be the only high point for them till they get to about the end of that year, because after the British leave Boston or evacuate Boston, the Americans have an incredibly difficult time dealing with the British military, because the King and the people in England are not happy with what happened, and they will throw everything they have at the Americans. After they drive the British out of Boston, George Washington and the Americans and the rest of the American military have a really difficult time. So I just want to note that the American military was not called the American military at that time. It was called the Continental Army. As I was saying, George Washington had a really difficult road ahead of him in 1776 after he drove the British out of Boston. And this book did an absolute fantastic job humanizing George Washington. As an American, growing up in school and reading about him in textbooks, you always view him as this stoic figure crossing the Delaware River in that famous painting. And this book shows that he was an actual person. He was tasked with commanding the Continental Army to fight the largest empire in the world at that time, the British Empire. Now, the Continental Army weren't all soldiers. They were just people. They were shop owners, or street sweepers, or farmers. they were just regular people, so they weren't disciplined like soldiers, and they were up against people. They were up against people who were disciplined like soldiers, who were in the British military, where they had an entire career as military men in the British military. They were up against some serious obstacles, and George Washington had a really difficult year and a really difficult time bringing together everyone. And this book, like I said, did a really good job humanizing George Washington. He had some really difficult decisions to make, and some were great. Of course, he made the right decisions at times because he won the war in the end, right? But in this book, we look at through the scope of just 1776. We see he made a great decision and drove the British out of Boston in March of 1776. And then along these way, he had an incredibly difficult time, and sometimes he made downright wrong decisions. And his leadership was questioned, not only from just the regular people in the Continental Army, but even the generals under him. He had people very close to him that seriously questioned his leadership. And this book will really flesh that out, will really explain to you who the man that George Washington was, and just all the hardships and difficulties that he faced along the way in 1776 while facing the biggest military might in the world. This book talks about the British military side as well. They talk about General Howe, who commanded the army, and it talked about his successes, his vices. He had some serious vices. He was totally sleeping with some other dude's wife. This book also talks about General Henry Clinton with the British military, who was very frustrated with General Howe's approach in combating the rebels in America. Real quick, General Howe took a very safe approach. He was seasoned, he knew what he was doing. He took a very safe approach going through the terrain. So at times he took his time, and this actually allowed the Americans to get away. And so General Clinton was very frustrated with this approach that Howe had. And you'll learn about this in this book. This book humanizes just about every key figure in the Revolutionary War in 1776. Another thing that we learn about are the Hessian soldiers, which were a group of mercenaries. They were German mercenaries that fought for the British military. You'll learn about all these key players. You'll learn that there were spies. There were British spies. There were American spies. There were American defectors. People on the American side went over to the British side. People on the British side that went over to the American side. You'll learn about a failed plot to assassinate George Washington. This happened in New York, or at the time they called it York Island. This happened inside New York, on the island of Manhattan. You'll learn about the issuing of the Declaration of Independence, which famously, as we all know, happens in July of that year. You'll learn a lot about New York, because New York, or at that time it was called York Island, but just that New York area was a very important location for both sides, and the British desperately wanted to get it. So they threw their might at it, and the Americans had a very, very difficult time defending New York. Had a difficult time defending the New York City area. The British sent ships into the New York harbor, and there was all sorts of disarray, and George Washington, he had some serious difficulty controlling the Continental Army. And the British took some serious advantage of that and strategically placed themselves all over the place around New York. You'll learn all about the Battle of Long Island, where the Americans lost. They lost really bad. It was a combination of just poor decision making. Again, this moment made people question George Washington's leadership. They completely lost that area of land. You'll learn about the evacuation of York Island, or Manhattan. They basically traveled up the island of Manhattan, and they were attacked during that period of time. And the Americans were in complete disarray. And George Washington got so angry, so furious. You'll learn about this in the book, that he got so furious that he rode his horse around shouting at everyone to get back into formation. He got so mad, his soldiers had to hold his horse down because he was riding within 100 yards of the enemy, which is, that's crazy. The man who's in command of the entire military, just riding within 100 yards, just furiously riding within 100 yards, just shouting at everyone to just stop freaking out. Again, this goes into explaining just how difficult it was, because these were just regular people. The Continental Army were just regular everyday people. They weren't disciplined soldiers. So he had a really difficult time. You'll learn about the retreats in up New York, the escape into New Jersey. You'll learn about the crushing loss of Fort Washington in the northern part of the island of Manhattan, or York Island. You will learn that there's some very graphic accounts of the British invading that fort. This book will explain in some serious graphic detail how these battles played out. And so like I said, you will learn about the crushing loss of Fort Washington. Like I said, it was a very difficult year for the Continental Army, for George Washington, for the Americans. This book will cover the Americans retreating deep into New Jersey as the British and the Hessians, as they are chasing them, and the Continental Army are retreating further, deeper into New Jersey. You'll learn about that as George Washington is dealing with the British military deep in the heart of New Jersey as they're retreating. George Washington opens a letter from Charles Lee to Joseph Reed. So Charles Lee and Joseph Reed were two very important people to the Continental Army. George Washington trusted those two people, and he learned from that letter just how much they didn't believe in George Washington's ability to lead. They questioned his leadership. They questioned a lot about him. So in this book, it will talk about George Washington. You know, he had a serious blow from reading that letter. He will go on and have that famous victory in Trenton, New Jersey after that. It's that famous moment where he crosses the Delaware River at night with a small group of people. He captures Trenton, New Jersey. He then goes on and captures Princeton, New Jersey. And that starts boosting morale, and it showed the tenacity, the integrity of George Washington. He did not give up. He never blinked. No matter what, when people were doubting him, he didn't blink. And he had plans, and he hatched them, and sometimes they worked, and sometimes they didn't. The famous one where he crossed the Delaware River and took Trenton, and then the one where he took Princeton worked. And that's where this book will leave you, because those events happened at the very end of 1776. So this is why I highly recommend the book 1776. You will feel like you lived in the year 1776. You will have an intimate understanding of that first year in the American Revolutionary War. You'll experience all the high points and the low points. And quite honestly, it was a really good read. It wasn't dry, very captivating, very dramatic. David Mccullough is a very good writer. He did a really good job paving this all out. So, like I said, this is why I highly recommend 1776 by David Mccullough. It was just fantastic. Go out right now, buy that book, buy a physical copy, digital copy, read it. You will not be disappointed. Bye.